Well, 2 years ago when I began filming, I was well aware of what President Obama called the pivot to Asia. This wasn't getting really much media at all in the West, but it was a very serious development. It meant, in effect, the greatest buildup of naval forces in the Asia Pacific since the Second World War. And this was at the time when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State. She was making a number of statements that, within the context of US-Chinese relations, were provocative. She said the South China Sea was an area of national interest, national security interest to the United States. She was also saying, as we now find out through WikiLeaks, that she was suggesting that the Pacific Ocean should be called the American Sea. But what was happening was a renewed US interest in the Pacific. And at that point, the issue of China claiming islands in the South China Sea and beginning to develop airstrips was becoming a big issue. Mm-hmm. But what wasn't an issue was the fact that China itself was surrounded by US bases. And I'd always been very, very aware of the extent of US military bases and presence around the world, especially in the Asia Pacific. And here we had 400 US bases, new ones in Australia, where I am now, in Darwin, Western Australia, extending all the way up through the Pacific, through the Philippines, new bases in the Philippines, after the Philippines had expelled two of the big bases mm-hmm. it had there, new bases there, up through Japan, Korea, all of these bases with really concentrating now with one target, as it were, and that's China. Why? And I suppose I wanted to find out why. Mm-hmm. So the journey began to make this film, and to me the timing of the film mm-hmm. is quite extraordinary, because here we have the new President Trump and his designated Secretary of State making the kind of Cold War threats towards China that were pretty well unknown a year or two ago. Something has happened. So this development that began with Obama in 2011 actually began with Hillary Clinton mm-hmm. in 2009, has now come round to Trump making all kinds of provocative noises towards China.
Indeed.
That's the essence of this film. The film asks why, but it takes some very interesting twists and turns.
Sure, sure.
It's also about the threat of nuclear war that has never gone away. And of course, any threat from one nuclear power to another suggests that nuclear war is a possibility. So that is the overall reason for making this film.
Yeah. Do you think 2 years on since you made this film, do you think what you were imagining or what you were cautioning people against in that film, do you think that worry is more imminent at this moment? I mean, when you were making this movie, you had no idea that President Trump is going to win the presidential election, and he's going to nominate Tillerson as his potential Secretary of State, who is now describing China's intention on South mm-hmm. China Sea as that of Crimea.
My own view, my personal view, is that although a lot of noise is coming from Trump, Trump is no more dangerous than Obama and his Secretary of Defense. Some of the most provocative, aggressive statements came out of the Pentagon during the Obama years. And really this whole policy of, if you like, confronting China was born during the Obama years and has been picked up by Trump. Trump clearly has a problem with China. For one thing, he promised a lot of people during his election campaign that he'd get them jobs again. And he blamed China for taking their jobs away. There was a certain absurdity about this. So it seems very much part of Trump's policies, as far as we can tell, is to change the rules of trade engagement with China. How he does that, I don't know. I mean, there are contradictions here. For one thing, he seems to be wanting to make peace with Russia.
Yes.
That is one coherent strand all the way through Trump's dialogue or his electioneering. He wants to do some kind of a deal with Putin. My own view is then we must ask the question, why then is he so aggressive to China? Although Trump doesn't represent the current US national security establishment, and we're seeing the reaction of this national security establishment to Trump as they try and put hurdles in his way even before he is inaugurated as president. But my own sense is that the United States, at this very critical time in its history, when it feels its world dominance ebbing away, that it is almost doing the reverse of what Richard Nixon did in the early 70s. He's trying to divide Russia and China. So make peace with Russia and be aggressive towards China. It was the other way round with Nixon.
Yeah.
It was make peace with China and be aggressive to Russia.
Somehow we're
That's
feeling...
only a theory.
Yeah.
Something has to explain this.
Yes, yes. We're all anxious about what exactly is going to happen, what exactly is his intention. And also, let's not forget, he has also nominated very hawkish persons in his future cabinet. For instance, the defense minister is the so-called Mad Dog Mattis, who is also very hawkish on policies with China. So we are going to
look,
to see.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you have to consider that Defense Secretary Ash Carter was, in my opinion, one of the most verbose provocateurs, one of the most aggressive secretaries of defense I've known. The man barely gets up in the morning before he's making some aggressive statement about either China or Russia or all the US perceived enemies. And he made a very interesting speech about this time last year to the Washington Club, in which he said, and I paraphrase him, but those who challenge the dominance of the United States, we will confront. And I think that's what this is about. I think there are many things here. There's Trump's own view of grandstanding on behalf of all those that he promised to make the economic situation of the United States better again. There's also the national security establishment, that great mass in the United States, wanting to say we are still in charge, we are still the top dog. There's even a touch of imperial pride. I've always thought modern United States was essentially a 19th century country. It behaves in the way that Britain did in the late 19th and early 20th century.
What is the potential? What is the potential?
A kind of militarism first.
Yes. What is the potential consequences of this kind of imperial sentiment, fearing the loss of face sometimes of their declining influence in the Asia Pacific, especially when we are talking about a coming war on China? If indeed a confrontation happens between China and the United States as a result of the United States provocation, what would be the potential implication for that region and for the world at large?
Well, the implications are disastrous, of course. Any war between great states, particularly nuclear-armed states, such as the United States and China, is a disaster. And I really don't think that those in the United States who are leading this, let's say this policy of provocation, really want a nuclear war. Why would they? It makes, unless you're demented, it makes absolutely no sense. But wars happen by mistake and accident. And we've already seen the US sending low draft ships right up to the international line in Chinese waters. We've seen them challenging, going through, overflying the islands in the South China Sea. We've seen a number of provocative acts to which China has responded. There's no question about that. For example, in 2015, one of the biggest air-sea military exercises in history, Talisman Sabre, rehearsed a blockade on China through the Malacca Straits and the Lombok Straits. The US Navy, with its air-sea battle plans, has been rehearsing this kind of trade war, trade blockade on China for quite some time. I would have thought that China is building these airstrips as a defensive measure. I don't know, I'm not privy to why, but it's certainly every time the US sails one of its ships, overflies these possessions, there is a reaction from China. That's a very dangerous situation.
What are the institutional roots that got the United States politics, the US people, into where they are today at this moment?
I think it began to happen about 1950. The US became a great power, a great military power, and a great economic power, a great institutional power, banking power, as a consequence of the Second World War. Europe was devastated. Britain was devastated. The old imperial powers were devastated. China was devastated. Japan was devastated. The United States was not. The United States emerged in 1945 as a power that perhaps even those running the US never imagined it would become. And my own view is that the US assumed this, almost this self-given role as the world's great power during the Korean War, when it saw that it had two great competitors, particularly the Soviet Union and also in China, but particularly the Soviet Union. And it assumed this role as, it's still called in the Western press, the leader of the free world. Although those of us who are outside the United States would question that, that terminology, but within the US power structure, that is a very powerful force. It's like a political presence in the United States. And that comes back to the fact that that role has changed, that US power is not as it was. It is militarily, there's nothing to match it militarily.
Yes.
However, Russia again is catching up. China is again starting to, if not catch up, but certainly build up its military power. But in terms of its economic power, the United States is a shadow of what it was in 1945-50. It is no longer a manufacturing, effectively a great manufacturing state. Its largest company, Apple, makes its products in southern China. So the world has changed in the distribution of goods, of manufacturing, of workshops, of trade, and so on. There are new rules, there are new forces, new power. And the United States, great power, which began, as I say, after the Second World War, ran right through the First Cold War, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, finally in the 1980s when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States saw itself then as the victor in the Cold War. But of course the 1980s was the same time that China was the time of Deng Xiaoping and the extraordinary rise of China. So the world has changed around the United States. And my own view is that those very powerful institutions within the US that have exercised such control over, for instance, banking, the US Treasury, control over the World Bank, the IMF, the Asian Development Bank, the Latin American Development Bank. The banking infrastructure has changed. Here, China has now established a new bank to which a lot of America's allies have come.
Yes.
So that power, which was essential to US power, has changed.
Yes. Now, while you were making this documentary, I understand that you traveled extensively to the Pacific, to the Bikini Island, for instance, where where the locals were used as guinea pigs to see the effects of hydrogen bombs. You also traveled to China and other areas. What did you learn through these travels about how the Chinese perceive this kind of threat against their country?
Well, I learned a number of things. I learned again, and I've made a number of films about nuclear weapons and the potential of nuclear war. I learned again that we must not forget the huge risk. When I went to the Marshall Islands and filmed on Bikini, there were several reasons. One was to show that here's really where the nuclear age got underway, you know, between 1946 and 1958. Something like the equivalent of one Hiroshima bomb was exploded, tested in the Marshall Islands. And right in the Marshall Islands is one of the US's biggest and most secretive bases on the island of Kwajalein. It's called the Ronald Reagan Missile Test Site. And it was, when you look at the old archive, as I did in making this film, the reason this base was set up was, as the commentator said, the threat from communist China. So the connection between where the nuclear age really was tested, apart from Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of course, but where it was tested in the 1950s, At the same time, this very important base, which commands the Pacific in terms of its space, it's a space base. It fires rockets and has rockets fired at it from the United States. It's a major test site. The whole aim of this base is China.
Yes. Let me ask you the question here.
Now that's
John,
been
please,
there for...
Please let me interrupt you here. I understand that was the era, that was the thinking during those times, that the people in the United States or in the West were very, how should I say, feeling very threatened by whatever was potentially coming from the communist China. But that was during the Cold War, or right before that. Right now, the Cold War, we say, has finished. Do we still have to worry about such things? I mean, should we look further? Is the threat of nuclear war still a realistic threat?
Yes, it is a realistic threat, and I think there is a second Cold War. It's a completely unnecessary Cold War. The first Cold War was unnecessary too, but this one is especially unnecessary. You know, China and the United States, as one of my interviewees in the film, Eric Lee, says China and the United States are connected, are locked in with each other. No two countries, he says, have so many interests in common that the only way forward is clearly as a peaceful relationship. So the new China, if you like, the risen China and the United States have so much in common. The enormous trading relationships. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And whatever problems there are, as one of my interviewees in the film, he was Professor Ted Postel. He was advisor to the chief of US naval operations. He says, this is completely ridiculous that this is happening, that whatever differences can be worked out between the two countries, and in fact have been in the past. But as I say, something changed a couple of years ago, and Trump, it appears, we don't know yet. With Trump, it's very difficult to work out exactly what he wants and what he's doing. Well, it just seems what has been manufactured is a second Cold War. A second Cold War with Russia, there's no question about that. And a secondary second Cold War with China. And the question is why? Well, I think it is all about the fading dominance of the United States. It is not the top dog anymore. There are other great states. China is probably now the world's biggest economic state. Or second biggest, but it doesn't matter. It is in the course of a generation, China has become an enormous economic power. That is seen in Washington. For those who see the world in terms of American dominance, that is seen as a threat. Doesn't make a lot of sense to those of us who prefer a peaceful world, but that seems to be the rationale.
If these two countries were to avoid any direct conflict, either in trade or in military, what has to be done on the side of the United States and potentially on the side of China as well?
In terms of US military presence around the world, the US has probably about 1,000 bases across every continent, every ocean. As I mentioned at the beginning, some of these biggest and most provocative bases are in the Asia Pacific. In Okinawa, there are 32 US military installations. On the island of Jeju, Korean island of Jeju, A new base has been built by the South Korean Navy, in fact purpose-built for the US Navy, for Aegis destroyers, nuclear submarines, etc. You know, something like 400 miles from Shanghai. Why? To contain China. But why? Why contain China? One US diplomat said to me in the making of this film, we can't seem to come to terms with the fact that we now have excuse me, we can't seem to come to terms with the fact that we now have to share the world, share our region, even share the Pacific Ocean. There is another great state on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. There's no reason why these two states can't live with each other and live with each other on perfectly good terms. So why not? He was asking this rhetorical question.
Yeah. Well, it's reality that China
So these are very uncertain times.
Sure. It's reality that China is here. China is a huge country, the world's most populous country. The economy has risen greatly over the past few decades. This is not going to change. We're not going to bound our hands and say, let's stop growing. This is not possible. The Chinese people are hardworking people and will try everything. But in the end, in our blood, we're a peace-loving country. We never invaded anybody. But the mere fact we're here in this part of the world seems to be something not acceptable for another country across the Pacific. So I guess while we are showing everything we can to demonstrate our goodwill and our peaceful nature, it is probably on the other side of the Pacific Ocean that they have to realize that they have to share this world with not just China, many other countries that are emerging in the global arena.